Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine worsening fuel shortages in Cuba that have triggered prolonged nationwide blackouts, with increasing implications for essential services, economic stability, and the tourism sector. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we assess the first trilateral talks between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, alongside continued Russian strikes. A disrupted Islamic State attack plot in Azerbaijan that points to growing militant interest in the Caucasus. The arrival of a U.S. carrier strike group in the Middle East amid a direct ultimatum to Iran. And the rapidly deteriorating security situation in South Sudan, where a return to full-scale civil war is increasingly likely. And in Asia-Pacific, we look at enhanced airport health screenings across the region following new Nipah virus cases in India, which are likely to result in travel delays at several major transit hubs. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Cuba is experiencing widespread and prolonged power outages driven by acute fuel shortages and long-standing grid vulnerabilities. Starting on January 26th, several parts of the country experienced extended blackouts caused by these shortages and by persistent constraints within the national grid. Some areas reportedly lost power for more than 30 hours, while large sections of Havana endured at least 15 hours without electricity. The outages coincided with the January 27th to 28th celebrations, marking the birth of José Martí, the 19th century revolutionary and one of the leaders of Cuba's War of Independence from Spain. The disruption affected essential services, telecommunications, transport and businesses, although most critical state facilities, including hospitals and major hotels, were not significantly impacted. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Cuba has experienced cyclical power outages since 2022, with the frequency and severity of blackouts increasing due to aging infrastructure, rising demand, and persistent fuel shortages. This latest crisis has almost certainly been compounded by the U.S. capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, interdictions of Venezuela's dark tanker fleet, and the reallocation of Venezuelan oil to other markets. Together, these developments have significantly reduced fuel imports to Cuba. On January 28th, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum announced a temporary pause in fuel shipments to the island. Mexico has been Cuba's primary supplier of oil since Venezuelan deliveries ended, so the decision represents a notable shift. It was likely a major concession to Washington, which is effectively attempting to isolate Cuba. President Trump has commented that the Cuban regime is very close to falling. Cuba's tourism sector, which accounts for roughly 10% of national GDP, has declined sharply in recent years due to blackouts, service disruptions, water shortages, antiquated infrastructure, and wider economic instability. Continued isolation is likely to further reduce tourist arrivals and foreign currency inflows, deepening the current economic crisis. Many major hotels and resorts with backup generators have so far managed to maintain basic services such as lighting, air conditioning, and running water, even during prolonged blackouts. However, the scale of the fuel crisis is increasingly likely to affect these areas as well, further undermining confidence in Cuba's tourism sector. Despite the crisis, Cuba has seen relatively little unrest in recent years. The two waves of protests in March and October 2024 remained limited in scope. Even so, the government introduced several measures to contain them before they could gain momentum. These included blocking internet access, deploying large numbers of police to deter further gatherings, and offering inducements such as emergency subsidies for basic goods. The last major wave of protests occurred in 2021 and was driven by shortages of food and medicine. In response, authorities adopted harsh measures. carrying out mass arrests and organizing hundreds of trials involving both participants and bystanders. These cases likely illustrate how Havana might react to further unrest, depending on its scale and intensity. Still, a carrot-and-stick approach is unlikely to remain effective if fuel shipments continue to decline and sectors such as tourism continue to stagnate. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where the United States, Russia, and Ukraine have held their first trilateral talks since 2022, even as Russian forces continue large-scale strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. Between January 23rd and 24th, US, Russian and Ukrainian delegations met in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates for their first trilateral discussions since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The talks reportedly addressed key issues including territorial demands in Donbass, disputed claims over control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, and the steps required to ensure the war is brought to an end and cannot resume. US officials said the talks went as well as we could have expected, with the three delegations even sitting together for a joint lunch. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the discussions as constructive. At the same time, Russian forces carried out large-scale strikes against Ukraine overnight on January 23rd to 24th, primarily targeting energy infrastructure, particularly in Kyiv. On January 25th, Zelensky stated that the document outlining U.S. security guarantees is 100% ready and is now only awaiting a date and place for signing. The proposal would then need to be ratified by Ukraine's parliament and the U.S. Congress. However, according to 8 sources who briefed the Financial Times, the Trump administration has indicated that these guarantees are contingent on Kyiv agreeing to a peace deal with Russia, which would likely involve ceding the entirety of the Donbass. This claim was denied by the deputy White House press secretary, who said, "It's a shame that the Financial Times is letting malicious actors lie anonymously." Now our intelligence assessment. While these were the first trilateral talks involving the US, Ukraine, and Russia since the 2022 full-scale invasion, Russian and Ukrainian delegations had previously met directly in mid-2025 for discussions in Istanbul, Turkey. Aside from prisoner of war and body exchanges, however, those talks produced no substantive outcomes. The ground for the Abu Dhabi trilateral meeting was laid by the Trump-Zelensky talks at Davos and the Witkoff/Kushner-Putin meeting in Moscow on January 22nd. Further diplomatic meetings are expected on February 1st in Abu Dhabi. A U.S. official has also claimed that a meeting between Putin and Zelensky is close, though the delegations would need to meet first in either Moscow or Kyiv. It is unlikely that the ongoing diplomacy will produce an imminent peace agreement, particularly if the Trump administration's reported signaling that U.S. security guarantees are contingent on Ukraine ceding the Donbass is both accurate and maintained. The Kremlin has maintained a negotiating position that any agreement would require Ukraine to cede the Donbass. During and after the trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, Kremlin Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov referred to the Anchorage formula for addressing the territorial question, while Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov reiterated Russia's commitment to the fundamental understandings the Kremlin claims were established at the 2025 Russia-US summit in Anchorage, Alaska. The Alaska summit did not produce any published or publicly available agreements, an ambiguity the Kremlin has likely exploited in its messaging. However, a Kremlin source has briefed that Moscow considers the Anchorage formula to include the ceding of all the Donbass and the freezing of current front lines elsewhere in Ukraine. However, a full Ukrainian withdrawal from the remaining unoccupied sections of Donbass without credible and robust security guarantees would likely pose an existential threat to Ukraine's sovereignty if realized. Donetsk Oblast has seen the most intense fighting and the largest battles of the war. Ukraine continues to hold numerous fortified cities, including the extensive Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, which together form what has been termed the fortress belt. While there have been concerning developments for Ukrainian forces along this front, such as the largely overrun city of Pokrovsk in late 2025, most estimates still suggest that Russian forces will be unable to seize all of Donetsk militarily before 2027 or 2028, assuming continued international support for Ukraine. Ceding the fortress belt without implemented security guarantees would therefore mean Ukraine forfeiting its most defensible line and exposing less fortified areas to potential future Russian advances. Fundamentally, this creates a chicken and egg dilemma. Ukraine cannot cede Donbass without U.S. security guarantees in place. Yet the Trump administration is reportedly indicating that these guarantees will not be provided unless Donbass is ceded. Moreover, it is highly unlikely that the Russian delegation is empowered to make concessions beyond the Kremlin's reiterated maximalist demands, which it frames as addressing the alleged root causes of the conflict. Even so, Moscow is likely to continue engaging in diplomatic initiatives promoted by Washington. Doing so allows it to ward off increased U.S. pressure, portray Ukraine as the primary obstacle to peace, and seek concessions that could support the Kremlin's broader objectives. It is also almost certain that Russian forces will continue to carry out large-scale strikes against Ukraine, with such attacks often coinciding with diplomatic talks, as they did on January 23rd to 24th. Staying in the region, in Azerbaijan, security forces have disrupted an Islamic State-linked plot targeting an embassy in Baku, highlighting growing militant interest in the Caucasus. On January 27th, Azerbaijani authorities announced the arrest of 3 suspects accused of planning an attack against an embassy in the capital. According to prosecutors, the group had prepared the attack on behalf of Islamic State Khorasan province, the branch of the Islamic State predominantly based in Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan, after reportedly coordinating with ISKP members abroad. While authorities did not identify which embassy was targeted, some local sources have pointed to the Israeli embassy. Officials indicated that the planned attack was motivated by religious hostility. Now our team's assessment. IS recognized an Azerbaijan province, ISAP, in 2019. However, the group carried out no notable operations in the country. In September 2024, an IS cell was discovered by accident in Kusar province in northern Azerbaijan, prompting several raids during which 8 Azerbaijani officers and an unspecified number of IS operatives were killed. Also in 2024, Azerbaijani security forces arrested a teenager for planning an attack on a synagogue in Baku, which was influenced by IS ideology. IS almost certainly retains an interest in striking Azerbaijan due to its Shia majority population and Baku's close relations with Israel and several Western nations. While the country is less central to the group than the Levant or Afghanistan, the Caucasus remains an important area for IS recruitment, with established militant networks, disenfranchised communities, and a strategic position as a logistics node between Europe and Asia. More active than ISAP, the Islamic State Caucasus Province, ISCP, operates primarily in Chechnya, Dagestan, and other parts of the Russian North Caucasus, and carried out several attacks in Russia in 2024. ISKP, although based in Afghanistan, has taken a leading role in external operations targeting Russia, most notably carrying out the 2024 Crocus Hall attack near Moscow, and has increasingly focused on Russia's flanks, including the Central Asian republics and the Caucasus. This role has likely been reinforced by the heterogeneity of ISKP's ranks, which include a significant proportion of foreign fighters from Tajikistan and other regions on Russia's periphery. The thwarted attack plot in Baku may indicate ISKP's growing ability to recruit and direct operatives beyond its traditional sphere of influence, which is likely one of the group's primary objectives. In its early stages, ISKP was only able to plan and execute attacks in Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. However, successful ISKP-linked attacks in Russia and Iran, along with multiple disrupted plots in Europe, suggest that the group's external operations capability and appeal have matured, a development likely accelerated by events in the Middle East. A series of disrupted plots and increased IS activity in Azerbaijan are likely early signs that the country and the wider region around it are becoming emerging theaters of interest for ISKP. Elsewhere in the region, the United States has deployed a carrier strike group into the CENTCOM area of responsibility as President Trump issues a direct ultimatum to Iran, significantly raising escalation risks. On January 26th, U.S. Central Command reported that the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had crossed the line of demarcation from the Indo-Pacific Command to the CENTCOM area of responsibility. The group consists of the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, supported by 3 guided missile destroyers capable of deploying Tomahawk cruise missiles. The carrier reportedly embarks squadrons of F/A-18E/F Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, F-35C fighter aircraft, and MH-60R/S helicopters. However, U.S. military officials noted that the strike group is not yet on station and will require between 1 and 3 days to complete its repositioning and assume its full operational posture. The sustained buildup of U.S. military assets in the region has also been evident. This includes the arrival of a U.S. Air Force RC-135W Rivet Joint, a high-altitude surveillance and signals intelligence aircraft designed to collect, analyze, and disseminate electronic intelligence such as radar emissions in support of intelligence gathering and targeting. An E-3 Sentry Airborne Early Warning and Control aircraft has also arrived, providing airspace surveillance, command and control, and broader battlespace management. Additional USAF aerial refuelers have reached key staging points across both the CENTCOM and European Command areas of responsibility. On January 27th, the U.S. announced that it will conduct a multi-day readiness exercise to demonstrate the ability to deploy, disperse, and sustain combat air power across the U.S. CENTCOM AOR. President Trump issued a public ultimatum to Iran on January 28th, stating that time is running out for Tehran, and that it must come to the negotiating table and agree to a deal that bans nuclear weapons and limits its nuclear program. The U.S. has also demanded that Iran reduce its ballistic missile capability and suspend all support for its proxy forces, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. President Trump also warned that if Iran refuses to negotiate, the U.S. is prepared to use force, with consequences far worse than previous actions. Iran has publicly rejected U.S. offers of negotiation, stating that talks cannot proceed while Washington is threatening military action and making what Tehran considers excessive demands. Iranian officials have continued to insist that any military action would be met with a strong and immediate response. Now, our assessment. The arrival of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group in the CENTCOM area of responsibility has almost certainly strengthened U.S. strike capability, deterrence and operational flexibility for offensive operations. Key regional partners such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia continue to stress publicly that U.S. bases on their territory are defensive in nature and intended to support regional stability rather than offensive action against Iran. Offensive capabilities have also been enhanced by the forward deployment of intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance assets, along with air refuelers, which could support long-range bombing missions against Iran. Taken together, these developments have significantly reduced observable pre-strike early warnings and indicator timelines, increasing tensions and the likelihood of rapid escalation. As the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group transitions to being fully on station, both the US and Iran are likely to increase ISR missions to monitor and assess each other's force posture and intent, and to improve targeting data and situational awareness. For the US, ISR efforts will likely prioritize mobile high-value targets such as Iranian air defense systems, ballistic missile transporter erector launchers, mobile UAV launch platforms, and command and control nodes. While the large-scale US aerial exercises are primarily intended to demonstrate readiness and combat capability, they will also likely be used to expand ISR collection and test Iranian reactions. For Iran, the main objective will likely be to find and fix the position of the US carrier strike group. Multiple Iranian UAV ISR missions over the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea have already been observed. The significant increase in military activity in the region has almost certainly raised the risk of miscalculation and rapid escalation, with minor tactical incidents or misinterpreted movements potentially triggering reciprocal strikes. However, US action has become increasingly likely should Iran fail to show any intent to engage with President Trump's ultimatum or agree to major concessions, particularly relating to its nuclear program. While the US does not currently have the same force posture it deployed during the 12-day war, it retains the ability to surge assets into the theater and already has credible military options available, including limited precision strikes. Commonly cited targets include Iranian leaders and the security forces believed to be responsible for recent killings, as well as nuclear sites, government institutions, and conventional military capabilities. Strikes on Iran would be likely to provoke some form of retaliation, with several options available to Tehran. These range from activating proxy forces to launching direct attacks on regional US military assets and economic interests. However, any non-symbolic Iranian action against Gulf states hosting US forces would carry a high risk of drawing those countries directly into the conflict, or prompting a policy reversal by the UAE and Saudi Arabia that would allow offensive operations from their territory. Such a shift would significantly expand US operational flexibility and its ability to sustain high-tempo operations against Iran. As a result, the most likely course of action is Iranian retaliation against Israel in conjunction with proxy forces. Tehran would judge this approach as a way to impose costs while limiting the risk of immediate US escalation and avoiding commitments from Gulf states to direct or indirect involvement. And in East Africa, South Sudanese forces have ordered civilians and UN personnel to evacuate parts of Jonglei State ahead of a major military offensive, increasing the likelihood of a return to full-scale civil war. On January 26th, the South Sudan People's Defense Forces instructed UN personnel and civilians to leave Nairol, Uro, and Akobo counties in Jonglei State within 48 hours. The warning follows a troop buildup in Bor ahead of a planned operation against the opposition Sudan People's Liberation Army in opposition. The counteroffensive, intended to reverse an ongoing SPLAIO advance, the group declared it had captured the town of Pajut, near Bor, on January 16th, has been nicknamed Operation Enduring Peace, and is reportedly imminent. More than 180,000 civilians have been displaced by the fighting, and the UN has warned that escalating violence is heightening the risk of mass violence against civilians. This risk is almost certainly exacerbated by statements from senior SSPDF figures, with one high-ranking military leader reportedly urging his troops to spare no one, including children, the elderly, and civilians. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The recent fighting in Jonglei State is the most significant since 2017, according to a UN statement, when South Sudan was in the midst of full-scale civil war. The clashes come amid a nearly year-long breakdown of the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. The agreement was signed between the two warring factions, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, whose military wing, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, was later rebranded as the SSPDF, and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition. The RAR-CSS allocated power between the SPLM, led by the ethnically Dinka President Salva Kiir, and the SPLMIO, led by the ethnically Nuer Vice President Riek Machar. An escalation in clashes involving the Nuer White Army Militia and the SSPDF led to Machar being placed under house arrest in March 2025, a move that threatened to collapse the agreement. While the peace framework remains technically in place, the ongoing fighting and the imminent government counteroffensive almost certainly threaten to end it, returning South Sudan to full-scale civil war. Pajut, the town recently captured by the SPLA-IO, is the administrative capital of Pajut Payam in Duke County. It lies 170 kilometers north of Bor, the Jonglei state capital. Its capture almost certainly threatens an SPLA-IO advance towards Bor, a politically symbolic town closely associated with former President John Garang, the founding leader of the SPLM, and the heartland of the Dinka Bor community, one of the most influential groups within the ruling elite. Should the SPLA-IO attempt to capture Bor, it would be highly likely to signal a return to civil war for South Sudan. Approximately 400,000 people died during the South Sudanese civil war, many of them civilians. Violence frequently followed Dinka-Nuer ethnic lines, with numerous massacres taking place. In April 2014, for example, SPLM/A-IO members separated Bentiu residents by ethnicity and perceived political affiliation, killing around 400 civilians in what was later labeled the Bentiu Massacre. A return to conflict along broadly ethnic lines would almost certainly raise the risk of civilians being explicitly and systematically targeted in ethnically motivated violence. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, multiple countries have introduced enhanced airport screenings for passengers arriving from India following new cases of Nipah virus, with transit delays increasingly likely. On January 28, authorities in Pakistan, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and Hong Kong introduced airport screenings, including temperature checks, for passengers arriving from India to prevent the spread of Nipah virus. Thailand has also assigned designated parking bays for aircraft arriving from areas with confirmed infections. These measures follow 2 confirmed cases in West Bengal on December 31, 2025, and January 2, 2026. Both involved health workers who had been working together. According to India's health ministry, the virus was contained in a timely manner, with 196 close contacts tested and no further outbreaks detected. Now our intelligence assessment, NIV, is zoonotic, transmitted primarily from pigs and fruit bats through direct contact or exposure to their excrement. It has a 4 to 14-day incubation period, with initial symptoms including fever, headache, myalgia, vomiting, and a sore throat. More serious complications can occur if the virus causes swelling of the brain, leading to dizziness, drowsiness, altered consciousness, acute encephalitis, atypical pneumonia, severe respiratory distress, and seizures. Once infected, the virus has a fatality rate of between 40 and 75% and is highly contagious. The World Health Organization considers it a high epidemic risk because there is no vaccine or treatment. However, NIV is not known to be contagious during the asymptomatic phase, which limits its potential spread. Its high fatality rate further constrains transmission, preventing it from spreading as rapidly as, for example, COVID-19, with its transmission rate calculated to be less than 1. NIV was first identified in 1998 among pig farmers in Malaysia and Singapore and killed more than 100 people. Outbreaks have occurred almost yearly in Asia since then, with India recording its first case in 2001. The size of these outbreaks has varied, ranging from small clusters to larger events. 4 separate outbreaks recently occurred in Bangladesh, with the World Health Organization confirming 4 cases between January 1st and August 29th, 2025. The increased airport checks will highly likely lengthen transit times at airports with enhanced screening measures for flights from, or with a layover in, India. Other countries are also highly likely to introduce similar screening requirements for arriving passengers. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.